So Michael's presentation is from the comfort of your own home, assembling comfortable telehealth encounters during COVID-19. Fantastic.
Thanks, Anthony. Yeah, thanks for having me here today. It's a real privilege to be presenting as part of this symposium. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded lands on which we're gathering and pay my respects to elders past and present. So today I'll present some qualitative analysis of 20 people's experiences of telehealth for alcohol and other drug concerns during the COVID-19 pandemic here in Victoria. So this is work in progress, and I'm not sure that there are too many surprises in what I'll present, but I'm really keen to hear your thoughts and ideas. So telehealth refers to the delivery of healthcare services like alcohol and other drug counselling via phone or video conferencing. And given all the Zoom meetings we've done over the past year and a half, I'm sure we can relate to some of the affordances of different formats. While telehealth has been around for a long time, there's been a rapid upscaling of telehealth during the COVID-19 pandemic. And as the headline on the screen here suggests, the implementation of telehealth was imbued with the hope that people, including people experiencing marginalisation and stigma, could easily and flexibly access healthcare from the comfort of their own home. Kieran spoke so eloquently before about the problematic assumptions related to home earlier, so thanks, Kieran. But as well as being enacted as a key side of the public health solution to containing the COVID-19 pandemic, the home is also a site where COVID-19 impacts have materialised quite acutely, as I'm sure we're all intimately aware, sometimes affording comfort for those with homes, but also discomfort as restrictions wore on. While I'm not a numbers person, a quick literature search indicates that there's been increasing research interest in telehealth since the start of the pandemic, as you can see there on the screen. Much of this has been health research focused on experiences, effectiveness and impacts of telehealth, which are seen as deriving primarily from human elements like clinicians and their ability to communicate and cultivate a therapeutic relationship with the client, sometimes in the absence of nonverbal cues. Notably, there's been less emphasis on the role of clients in the labour of telehealth. And while the role of spaces and objects are partially acknowledged in public health statements that link telehealth with the comfort of one's home, for instance, these elements are typically treated as relatively inert, stable contexts that at most play a minor role. However, this narrow focus potentially obscures a range of human and more than human elements at work in telehealth encounters and the comfort or discomfort that is produced through these encounters. So in order to attend more closely to these in participants' interview accounts, we're playing with a few theoretical tools. Firstly, we're drawing on a post-humanist approach that invites us to view telehealth encounters and contexts as relational and dynamic, and attunes us to the work of often neglected more than human elements in the production of telehealth. And Simone's keynote earlier really spoke really well to these post-humanist approaches and unpacked them in greater detail. Assemblages can be thought of as the bundles of interacting moving human and more than human elements such as objects, places and times that coalesce in specific configurations to produce particular effects. Rather than isolating agency in one element alone, for example, the clinician of telehealth, or seeing effects as predictable, assemblage thinking views agency as distributed and effects as emerging through assemblages. So we're interested in how telehealth is assembled differently in different situations and with different effects. Similarly, using these tools, we're kind of thinking about comfort not as a stable or predictable effect of, say, the home, as imbued in the hopes for telehealth, but as the fit between bodies and objects and other elements assembled in particular space-times. Specifically, we foreground the often overlooked preparatory work that clients and the space-times, objects and practices in which they're entangled do to use telehealth comfortably. I suppose the first thing to say is that we noted a shift in how much work different elements were doing in telehealth encounters as service providers struggled with telehealth during the pandemic. For example, Don, a participant here, says, I'd set up all of the Zoom and everything. I was actually using my account for the first couple of sessions because the organization hadn't sorted out their Zoom and everything. I actually set it up first and then said, look, this is my link, just link to this. So combined with the technology, Don's efforts illustrate a high level of technical mastery and work in preparing for and establishing telehealth encounters. While clients and technologies do work in in-person encounters, services would generally be doing more of this work of providing access to in-person care spaces and platforms in pre-COVID times. With this in mind, I'll now explore how clients and more than human elements coalesced to cultivate space times that in some cases afforded comfort and privacy, but not always. So many participants talked about taking telehealth calls from a specific space in their home. And as Lucy discussed here on the screen, this was quite often a bedroom for people that had homes. As Lucy indicates, the level of comfort a particular space afforded was a key consideration, as were availability, privacy, and the presence of other people. Participants who lived with other people often engaged in negotiations and planning to secure private spaces at particular times for appointments. Tanya, who stayed with her parents, often warned them that a telehealth call was scheduled, saying, because my parents understood the circumstances, so I just sort of said, my counsellor's going to be ringing and it goes for about 45 minutes. This is the time frame. So there were no privacy issues there. Here we can see how private space times materialized as a relational achievement involving the schedules and mobilities of others, who in turn were involved in ensuring that they didn't infringe on negotiated space times. While the home and a range of other elements did enable comfort to be realized when assembled in particular ways, this wasn't always the case, of course. Here Amanda says, if I was inside, I was scared my kids would hear my telehealth session, but if I was outside, my neighbours are going to hear me. So Amanda went on to talk about how the lack of a private space inside or outside of the home materialized in uneasy telehealth encounters where she was preoccupied with being overheard, as well as the presence of other people and the arrangement of spaces in houses, the potentially gendered caregiving arrangements, concerns about judgment and stigma also associated with drug use were also at work in accounts like Amanda's. So the discomfort of home led, or the lack of availability of home, led some participants to cultivate more comfortable spaces for telehealth outside the home. Here Zane says, I've got my son and his mother staying with me at the moment. So usually to get some privacy, I just come out and sit in my car and just do a phone from there. So as well as the availability of a car, potentially a garage or a secluded street, other people, caregiving responsibilities, and stigma are also important in the assembling of car telehealth spaces. Where appropriate house or car spaces weren't available, participants and a range of other elements found, and with varying degrees of success, made secluded public spaces for telehealth sessions. Here Ray says, I ended up taking a lot of the calls in parks around the city. I've actually found some really cool little spots around. There are a couple of times though where I had an issue finding a secluded spot, but I've got headphones that I can speak into, so that's not a huge deal. As we can see here, the availability of secluded public spaces and headphones came together to enable Ray to engage in telehealth comfortably. As he intimates though, seclusion does not always materialize in public. Lockdown restrictions may have also constrained opportunities for engaging in telehealth in public spaces, which may have emerged as transgressive or could have incurred fines or other legal consequences if they, I guess, transgressed the rules or restrictions. Unlike Ray's public space assemblage though, which also involved time and careful planning and preparation, Sarah says, it's happened a couple of times where I've made an appointment with my GP I'd been out doing shopping or an errand or getting food, and I forgot I had this appointment, and I had a quick chat to them, and it just kind of ticked the boxes and hung up. It doesn't feel real. I'm like, did I have that appointment? I can't remember. This assemblage involving busy shopping centres, everyday practices, and forgetting appointments, as we all do, materialised in uncomfortable, unsatisfying, and unmemorable telehealth encounters. But sometimes comfortable telehealth encounters did not emerge despite the best intentions and work of a range of elements, highlighting the fragility of telehealth assemblages. For instance, James, who lived in a rural area, described how he would drive about 30 minutes away from his home to get phone reception to attend a telehealth appointment. And even then, he says, it might sound odd, but it depends which way the wind is blowing, depends if there's clouds, depends if it's dark weather, depends if it's just, I don't know, bloody Telstra not working, just quite unpredictable. As James suggests, it's sometimes difficult to get all the elements and moving parts, including the technology, the telecommunications provider, the rural location, the weather, configured well in ways that were productive. I guess in the accounts presented so far, you might have noticed the number of objects that were gathered into telehealth assemblages and sometimes helped to produce those comfortable or not so comfortable encounters. This included things like telecommunications devices, furniture, cars, headphones, and I just wanted to briefly highlight some additional objects at work as we go along. One of these is clothing, or as Don says, I had to make sure that I had set up a nice little area that was productive, that felt safe. I made sure I wasn't just in lounge around clothes. I actually put on a certain outfit to wear like I was actually going out. When I was on telehealth, I would act like I was going to an in-person appointment anyway, because it helped me to stay engaged. So entangled in cultivating a safe and productive space, non-lounge around clothes enabled the production of a situation similar to an in-person appointment, not necessarily about comfort, but about priming for the therapeutic activity and engagement. And as I'm sure many of us have experienced during lockdown, sometimes it was useful, albeit uncomfortable, to disrupt the repetition and cultivate different embodied feelings and atmospheres by dressing differently for particular occasions.
Just 3 minutes, Michael.
Thanks, Anthony. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so more than human elements were also involved in practices that participants engaged in to cultivate calm and manage the anticipated unease that accompanied some care encounters. So being in home spaces afforded participants opportunities to engage in different everyday practices that they might not have otherwise been able to do during in-person appointments. Here, Kate says, at times, if I get anxious, I'll walk around, I might put some washing on and something like that, something quite mundane. I wouldn't be reading a book whilst trying to do a session, but yeah, anxiety would lead me to try and take the focus of some of the difficult conversation and the different topics that I found hard. Oh, sorry, it's a little bit slow there. Sorry, a few participants also described how telehealth afforded opportunities to consume drugs and other things. So for example, Amanda, who had concerns about her cannabis use, says, it was lockdown, so I had my kids at home. I was like, will I go out the back to talk, because I wouldn't be able to talk, otherwise they would hear me, which isn't good. So I just have a cup of tea, then I make some joints and smoke them and talk to the counsellor while I was stoned to calm me down. It's worth noting that service providers often discourage drug consumption before or during a session, or even refuse to provide care to people who are deemed under the influence. However, audio-only telehealth formats, along with the home spaces and the lockdown circumstances, enabled people to continue to be available of care, even if they'd just consumed drugs. Indeed, for Amanda, cannabis consumption before or during a session did produce multiple effects and created somewhat of an unresolved dilemma. On the one hand, she says, I can talk and go deep and stuff while consuming cannabis, but the whole point is for me to stop. And if I'm smoking, then telehealth, it's not really that helpful. So what might we make of all this? And I've just tried, these are kind of tentative thoughts and implications. So as I've illustrated, we might say that telehealth encounters and the hopes for comfort that were imbued in them in the implementation of telehealth during COVID-19 emerged through assemblages of human and more than human elements. Telehealth encounters emerge comfortably for some clients, often due to their labour, resources and preparation and the work of a range of other more than human elements. For other more marginalised clients in particular, and despite their labour and work, the hopes and ambitions imbued in telehealth failed to materialise as easily or smoothly, or if at all. This raises questions about what can be done to ensure that the hopes for care in crisis materialise in more productive ways that aren't overly reliant on the preparatory work of potentially marginalised groups and the spaces, objects and practices in which they're entangled. Well, I'm still kind of thinking through this big question, and I'm keen to hear your thoughts. I wonder whether resourcing people for the preparatory labour and some of the more than human elements involved, I'm thinking, you know, devices, for example, could be a start. If returning to some of the theory and some of Sarah Ahmed's work, if the fit between bodies and objects and other elements assembled in particular space-times isn't so good, and I wonder whether, you know, building in flexibility and allowing exceptions to service and government policies might be useful. So for instance, if comfortable telehealth encounters can't materialise in home or in public spaces, then allowing people to utilise service spaces and objects might be useful. So yeah, I'll leave it there. I'd like to thank all the people involved in the project, especially the participants who generously shared their accounts with us. And yeah, thank you all for listening as well. I really appreciate it. Bye.
Thanks so much, Michael. Let's just see if there's any hands that come up. Great final slide. Simone's got a question. I don't know if Simone wants to come on to ask it, or I can ask it.
I just popped it in the chat, but I was really interested in that notion of the soundscape and your mapping of the city space. But just thinking about how those telehealth interactions produce different kinds of listening relations and what that dynamic does. It's really interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Simone. Yeah, that's a great point, a great comment. And I think, yeah, something that's potentially also neglected, even when we were, I guess, even thinking about our attunement to the data and sound as an element as well. And I think it's something that perhaps as a researcher too, like I could definitely listen to a little bit more closely in our data and in our accounts, and definitely worth exploring in greater detail, because I think it, as you point out, it's a potentially interesting element that affords different ways of engaging.
We've got Nicholas.
Thanks, Michael. That was a great presentation. I was just like, I think this is probably questions partly informed by a project that I'm working on at the moment, and that's examining LGBTIQA plus people's experience of suicidal behaviour. But I'm curious about sort of when you were doing, I imagine you were doing the interviews online, as we all have been doing kind of for the last kind of couple of years. But what about kind of, what are your own reflections on sort of when you're conducting those interviews about sort of how you go about, as a researcher, creating a safe and comfortable space for people to share their accounts?
Yeah, that's a great question, Nicholas. Yeah, a lot of all the interviews, yeah, were done via Zoom, or I guess the mediums that telehealth also use. So I think, and I'm sure that people would have lots of experience in the crowd about this, but I think it's all the stuff about kind of ensuring, you know, setting up expectations and kind of, yeah, kind of being flexible in the ways that we're kind of also suggesting that policy and service providers should, about, you know, if you're needing to stop checking in about people's comfort, or if other people are around, being attuned to what else is around. But I think that beyond that, I think it potentially there's some affordances in terms of, doing a project about telehealth and being in situ in the spaces where people might also be, might have also engaged in telehealth. So I think we didn't make as much of this as we could have, but I think there is some value in sort of, potentially there's potential, sort of methods that involve like guided tours, or, thinking about the space around you and mapping that potentially could have been afforded by this modality as well.
Roger, I can see you've got your hand up. If you've got a really quick, sorry to cut you off again.
I'm good like that. So, real quickly, I was interested in the social support and the kind of social capital networks, both of the people tuning in, like seeking telehealth, but also the people providing the telehealth. Just as a little example, I've got a friend who's a psychologist, and she tells me what it's like after 6 hours of having to listen to other people's problems, and she doesn't have anyone to talk to about her problems immediately, at least not very excessively. And the whole system at both ends feels like it relies on an awful lot of informal support. I just wanted your comments on that, please.
Oh, that's a great point, Roger. Yeah, and unfortunately we didn't in this project get the clinician kind of the clinician accounts and experience, but that I think would be it's a really astute observation that the telehealth kind of demands lots of different elements, and it would be worth, I think really interesting to kind of flip it around a little bit and think about what's happening and those support networks that are often sort of maybe neglected in sort of telehealth research that kind of just focuses on, I guess, the encounter or the event, but there's things that flow from that are worth exploring. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, and thank you, Michael.